Hello and welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Find a comfortable place to rest your head. Let the sounds of the world fade away and allow your mind to drift back in time with me. Tonight, we journey to the glittering courts of Renaissance Europe, a world of breathtaking art, soaring cathedrals, and powerful dynasties. We often picture this era through the lens of a fairy tale. A beautiful princess in a velvet gown, marrying a handsome prince to live happily ever after. But behind the silken tapestries and gilded thrones lay a much darker, more precarious reality. Did you know that for many of these royal brides, the title of queen or duchess offered not a shield of safety, but a target painted on their backs? Their lives were a constant, delicate balancing act, played for the highest stakes imaginable. So settle in, as we part the velvet curtains and explore the hidden dangers that awaited a Renaissance royal bride. And if you find a moment of peace in our journey tonight, perhaps consider subscribing. To join us for more quiet explorations of the past, the story of a royal bride begins not with a proposal, but with her very first breath. From the moment a princess was born, she was not seen as a child, but as a political asset. A chess piece to be moved across the map of Europe, her value was measured in the alliances she could forge, the territories she could secure, and the peace treaties she could seal with her hand in marriage. In the royal nursery, while her brothers might be given toy swords and taught the arts of war and governance, her world was shaped by a different set of expectations. Her future was a commodity, discussed in hushed tones by ambassadors and ministers in faraway council chambers. She was a promise, a living, breathing contract whose personal happiness was a footnote if it was considered at all. Her childhood was not her own. It belonged to the state, and her destiny was written in ink on treaties long before she could even read them herself. This was the first, and perhaps most profound, loss of safety, the loss of her own agency from the very beginning. Her life was a gilded cage, and the door had been locked from the outside since birth. The education of a princess was not about broadening her mind for its own sake, but about molding her into the perfect consort. It was a meticulous, years-long process of refinement and suppression. She would learn languages, not to read foreign poetry, but to converse with her future husband and his court. She would master the lute or the virginal, not for the love of music, but to provide pleasing entertainment and demonstrate her refined upbringing. She was taught embroidery, dancing, and the complex rules of courtly etiquette, all skills designed to make her an elegant, graceful, and unobtrusive ornament in her new home. Above all, she was taught the virtues of piety, obedience, and silence. Her own opinions were to be kept to herself, her desires sublimated for the good of the dynasty. Her education was, in essence, an education in submission, a careful polishing of a diplomatic tool. She was being prepared to be pleasing to a man she had never met, and to win the approval of a court that would view her with suspicion. Any spark of rebellion, any sign of a fiercely independent intellect, was a dangerous flaw to be stamped out. Her mind was being furnished and decorated just like a room in a palace, designed for the comfort and pleasure of its future master, not for the fulfillment of its inhabitant. Before she ever met her husband, she would often be married to him. This was the strange and impersonal ceremony of a proxy marriage. In a grand cathedral in her home country, the young bride would stand at the altar, dressed in all her finery, next to an ambassador or a high-ranking nobleman who stood in for the groom. This man, a stranger, would speak the vows on behalf of his king or duke. He might even place the ring on her finger. In some traditions, the ceremony was followed by a bizarre ritual where the proxy, fully clothed, would lie down on a bed next to the bride, sometimes placing a leg on top of her to symbolize the consummation of the union. It was a deeply symbolic act, signifying a complete transfer of ownership from her father to her new husband. For the young woman at the center of it all, it must have been a profoundly lonely and unsettling experience. She was now a wife in name, bound to a man she knew only through portraits and letters. Her life irrevocably changed by a ceremony where the most important person was not even present. The illusion of romance was stripped away, leaving only the cold, hard reality of a political transaction. With the proxy ceremony complete, the bride's life in her homeland was over. Now came the journey, a long and often terrifying ordeal that could last for weeks or even months. She would leave behind everyone she had ever known, her family, her friends, her ladies-in-waiting, and set out for a foreign land. These journeys were fraught with peril if she traveled by sea. She faced the wrath of unpredictable storms that could splinter a ship to pieces, or the constant threat of pirates who would see a royal convoy as the ultimate prize if she traveled by land. The roads were often little more than muddy tracks, and the danger of bandits hiding in the dense forests was ever present. Disease was a constant companion on these slow-moving journeys. A sudden fever or infection could sweep through her entourage with devastating speed. For the bride herself, this was a period of intense vulnerability. She was a precious piece of cargo, her safety paramount to the alliance. Yet she was exposed to the raw and untamed dangers of the world in a way she had never been before. Every creak of the ship's timbers, every rustle in the woods at night, must have filled her with a deep and chilling anxiety. She was suspended between two worlds, no longer belonging to her old home, and not yet arrived at her new one. The final stage of the journey was often the most psychologically daunting, at the border of her new kingdom. A formal handover ceremony would take place. Here, the bride would be forced to part with the last vestiges of her old life. Her own ladies-in-waiting, the familiar faces who had been with her since childhood, were often sent back home. She was made to shed her native clothing and be redressed in the fashion of her new country. This was a powerful and symbolic act of erasure. She was being stripped of her identity, her past, her culture. From this moment on, she was to be of this new land, and this land only. She would cross the border, often alone, or with only one or two trusted companions, to be met by a new household of strangers appointed by her husband. Imagine the profound isolation of that moment, standing on a political borderline, watching the last friendly faces disappear over the horizon. She was now truly alone. A foreigner in a strange land, about to meet the court, and the man who would hold absolute power over her life. The safety of familiarity was gone, replaced by the terrifying uncertainty of the unknown. After weeks or months of travel and anticipation, the moment of the first meeting would arrive. The pressure on the young bride was immense. She would be presented to her husband, a man she had likely only seen in a flattering, idealized portrait. Now she would see him in the flesh, and he would see her. Her entire future, her status, her comfort, and her physical safety could be decided in this single moment based on his first impression. Was she as beautiful as the portrait had promised? Was her demeanor pleasing? Did she seem suitably meek and fertile? His approval was everything. A flicker of disappointment in his eyes could spell disaster for her. If he found her unattractive or displeasing, she could face a life of cold neglect, or even repudiation, which would be the ultimate disgrace. The entire court would be watching, whispering, judging. Her every gesture, every word would be scrutinized. For a young woman, often just a teenager, this moment must have been the most intense and terrifying ordeal of her life. It was not a romantic meeting of two lovers, but a high-stakes inspection of a very valuable and very vulnerable piece of property. Having survived the first meeting with her husband, the bride now faced the gauntlet of the court. A royal court was not a welcoming place. It was a complex web of shifting alliances, hidden rivalries, and simmering resentments. To them, she was not their beloved new queen. She was a foreigner, an outsider. Many would view her with deep suspicion. Was she a spy for her home country? Would she try to fill powerful positions with her own foreign favorites, displacing the established nobility? Every friend she made could be a potential enemy in disguise. Every piece of advice could be a trap. The Queen Mother, her new mother-in-law, could see her as a rival for her son's affection and influence. The king's powerful ministers might resent her potential sway over him. And then there were the other court ladies, all vying for position and favor, who would see the new queen as a threat to their own standing. She had to learn the unspoken rules of this new world, and learn them quickly. A misspoken word, a misplaced confidence, or an unintentional slight could have devastating consequences. She was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone, a solitary ship navigating a sea of sharks. The wedding itself was a magnificent public spectacle, but it was followed by a ritual that was both deeply personal and brutally public, the bedding ceremony. After the grand feasts and celebrations, the bride and groom would be escorted to the bedchamber by a crowd of high-ranking courtiers. Bishops would bless the bed, nobles would offer bawdy jokes and advice, and they would not leave until the couple were officially in bed together. In some cases, they would even wait outside the door for proof of consummation, the bloodied sheets to be displayed the next morning as evidence of the bride's virginity and the marriage's validity. This was the ultimate violation of privacy. A young, often terrified, bride was expected to perform the most intimate act of her life with a stranger, while an audience of powerful figures effectively listened at the door. There was no room for tenderness or romance. Only the cold, hard duty of sealing the political alliance and beginning the process of creating an heir. Her body was not her own. It was a vessel for the continuation of the dynasty, and its first use was a matter of state to be witnessed and verified by all, once the wedding was consummated. The bride's primary and often sole purpose became clear. She had to produce a male heir. This was not a gentle hope. It was a relentless, crushing demand. Her value, her status, and her very safety at court depended on her ability to bear a son. A barren queen was a failure, a liability to the dynasty. Each month that passed without a pregnancy would bring more whispers, more worried glances from her husband and his counselors. The pressure was immense. She would be subjected to all manner of medieval medical advice, strange diets, potions, and endless prayers. If she produced only daughters, it was seen as her failure, her fault. A daughter could be a useful marriage pawn, but only a son could secure the succession. Without a son, her husband might begin to look for ways to set her aside, to annul the marriage and find a new wife who could fulfill her duty. Her position at court was never secure. It was a temporary contract, contingent upon the successful use of her womb. The queen who could not produce an heir was a queen in constant, mortal danger, while the pressure to conceive was immense. The act of giving birth was perhaps the single greatest physical danger a Renaissance woman, royal or not, would ever face. Childbirth was a brutal and often fatal affair. Medical knowledge was rudimentary at best. The concept of germs and hygiene was completely unknown, so infections were rampant and deadly. Midwives and physicians relied on superstition and ancient texts, their interventions often doing more harm than good. A difficult labor could last for days, ending in exhaustion and death for both mother and child. If the baby was breached, the procedures to turn it were agonizing and dangerous. Instruments were crude, and cesarean sections were almost never performed on a living mother. They were a last resort to save the baby after the mother had already died. Every pregnancy was a roll of the dice. The royal bride knew that the act which could secure her position as queen was also the act most likely to kill her. The birthing chamber was a private battlefield. And for countless women, it was where their story came to a tragic and painful end. Even if a queen successfully produced an heir, her position was not entirely safe. She had to contend with the almost universal reality of the royal mistress. A king's infidelity was not just accepted, it was expected, while the queen was chosen for political reasons. The mistress was often chosen for love or lust. This created a complex and dangerous dynamic. A powerful and ambitious mistress could wield enormous influence over the king. She could become a rival center of power at court, with her own faction of loyal followers. She might try to secure titles and lands for her own children, potentially challenging the legitimacy and inheritance of the queen's children. The queen was expected to tolerate this humiliation with grace and dignity. To show jealousy or anger was to risk alienating her husband completely. She had to engage in a subtle and constant political war with her rival, a war of influence, favor, and public perception. A beloved mistress could poison the king's mind against his own wife, turning a situation of neglect into one of active hostility and danger. The queen was not just a wife. She was a diplomat, caught between two powerful and often opposing forces, her birth family and her new family. She was expected to be loyal to her husband and his kingdom, but her father and brothers back home often saw her as their agent abroad. They would send her letters filled with coded instructions, asking her to influence her husband on matters of policy, to gather intelligence, or to advocate for their interests. This placed her in an impossible position. If she followed her birth family's instructions, she could be accused of treason by her new court. If she refused, she could be disowned by her own family, losing their protection. A single misstep, a letter intercepted, a secret whispered to the wrong person, could be her undoing. The charge of treason was the ultimate threat, a swift and certain path to imprisonment or the executioner's block. She was walking a political tightrope, with chasms of betrayal and death on either side. In a world where political rivals could be dispatched with alarming ease, the fear of poison was a constant, terrifying undercurrent of court life. A foreign queen was a particularly easy target for suspicion and accusation. If the king or a high-ranking noble fell suddenly ill, all eyes would turn to the outsider. Her knowledge of foreign herbs or medicines could be twisted and portrayed as an expertise in dark poisons. She was an easy scapegoat for any misfortune that befell the royal family, but the threat was not just in being accused, it was in being a victim. A rival at court, a jealous mistress, or a political faction that opposed the alliance she represented might see her death as a simple solution to their problems. Every meal could be a source of anxiety. Every cup of wine could be a potential threat. She had to rely on trusted food tasters, but even they could be bribed or threatened. This constant, low-level fear, the knowledge that a hidden enemy could strike at any moment with an invisible weapon, added another layer of profound psychological stress to her already precarious existence. It was a danger that was silent, unseen, and utterly terrifying. The greatest danger to a royal bride was often the man she was forced to marry. While some royal husbands were kind and respectful, many were not. A king or a duke held absolute power, not just over his subjects, but over his wife. If a husband was cruel, unstable, or prone to paranoia, the queen had no recourse. There was no one to appeal to, no escape. The history of the Renaissance is filled with stories of queens who suffered at the hands of their husbands. They were subjected to public humiliation, confined to remote castles or worse. The most infamous example, of course, is Henry VIII of England, who divorced 2 of his wives and had 2 more beheaded. His queens lived in a state of constant terror, their lives dependent on his ever-changing whims and his desperate quest for a male heir. A queen's safety was entirely contingent on her husband's temperament and his political security. If he felt threatened, she could become a convenient scapegoat. If he tired of her, she could be cast aside. The marriage bed could be a sanctuary, or it could be the most dangerous place in the entire kingdom. If a queen outlived her husband, her ordeal was not necessarily over. The life of a royal widow was a precarious one. If her son was the new king and was still a child, she might become the regent, wielding immense power. But this also made her a target for rival nobles who wanted to control the throne for themselves. She would have to fight to protect her son's inheritance and her own life. if her son was already an adult. She could be relegated to the position of a dowager queen, respected but politically powerless. In the worst-case scenario, if she had failed to produce an heir or if her husband's dynasty was overthrown, she could be left with nothing. She might be sent back to her home country in disgrace, a political failure, or she could be imprisoned, confined to a convent to live out her days, a forgotten ghost in the halls of power she once walked as a queen. Her safety and status were tied to her husband, and without him, she was often left vulnerable and alone once more. The dawn of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century added a volatile new element of danger to a royal bride's life: religion, as Europe fractured along religious lines. A marriage between a Catholic princess and a Protestant prince, or vice versa, became a political and spiritual minefield. A bride arriving in a country of a different faith was not just seen as a foreigner, she was seen as a heretic. The common people might despise her. Preachers might denounce her from the pulpit as an agent of the devil. She would be under immense pressure to convert to her husband's faith. If she refused, her loyalty would always be in question. She would be accused of plotting to restore her old religion, and any political or social unrest could be blamed on her heretical influence. This religious divide created a profound personal and public crisis for many queens. They were forced to choose between the faith of their childhood and the political necessity of their new role, a choice where either path could lead to condemnation, isolation, and mortal danger. The life of a Renaissance royal bride was not a fairy tale. It was a story of survival. These women were born into a world that saw them as pawns, their bodies and futures belonging to the state. They were sent into foreign lands alone. Forced to navigate treacherous courts filled with enemies, they faced the immense pressure to produce heirs, the life-threatening dangers of childbirth, and the constant threat of political intrigue, poison, and the whims of powerful husbands. Their safety was never a given. It was a prize that had to be earned, day after day, through intelligence, cunning, diplomacy, and an extraordinary amount of resilience. They lived within a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury but stripped of freedom and security. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember these women, not as passive princesses in portraits, but as strategists, survivors, and silent rulers in their own right, who navigated one of the most dangerous roles in history with courage and grace. Sleep well.